online results reporting site. The goals for today's conversation are to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the functionality of the site, as well as accessing the specific cuts of data that will be of interest to you. One thing to note before we begin is that this is a demo site, and because of that, you'll notice that the site is divided into two sections, one for employee engagement and one for culture of safety. The Culture of Safety tab is only for those organizations who have chosen to run an additional Culture of Safety survey with us, so for today's conversation, we'll be focusing on the employee engagement side only. From here, you'll notice that the site is divided into a series of tabs and sub-tabs, each of which will contain a different slice of data or tool that you can use to interact with the information that you see. I'm going to be starting on the Reports Summary sub-tab, because this is where all of your high-level information will be contained and where you'll be spending a bulk of your time. Now, before we look at the data themselves, there are two pieces of functionality I did want to call out because they will persist throughout all of the sub-tabs and tabs throughout the site. The first piece of functionality is the You Are Currently Viewing tab along the top of the page here. This box will allow you to know exactly which slice of the organization you're looking at any given point in time, which benchmark filters are being applied, and how many people fall into that specific group. This box will become increasingly helpful as you take advantage of the second piece of functionality I'd like to introduce you to, which are our results filters along the right-hand side of the screen. These are housed in this blue circle along the top right-hand side of the page, and when I click on them, we'll open up into a couple of different options that we can use. We're able to filter the data by the organizational structure, facility, department, and unit, as well as a reporting hierarchy, direct reports, and span of control. Direct reports will pertain to those individuals that report directly to you as a manager, and span of control will pertain to anybody that reports up through you or anyone that is within your purview. You'll notice that if I select one direct reports and hit apply, the You Are Currently Viewing tab along the top of the page will change to reflect the filters that we've applied. Notice it says we're looking at Teresa Black's direct reports, and there are 27 people who fall within this particular group. If at any time I want to return to the organization overall, I can simply click the Filters button, choose Reset along the bottom right-hand side, and the data will then repopulate to reflect the entire organization. Now, the first chart you'll come to on the Reports Summary page will be your engagement profile. This is going to let you know exactly what percentage of individuals fell into each of the 4 categories of engagement that we have: disengaged, ambivalent, content, and engaged. The blue bars are going to represent your performance or your organization's performance, and these bars are overlaid by 4 levels of our national benchmark: the 25th percentile on the bottom, median, 75th percentile, and then the 90th percentile along the top. For those of you who have used this result site before, you'll notice that that 4th benchmark, the 90th percentile, is relatively new. Underneath the engagement profile, you have a table outlining your percentile performance on 3 metrics that we believe are important: percent engaged, percent disengaged, and engagement index. You'll notice that this table lists both your raw score as well as your percentile ranking for each one of these metrics. As a quick reminder, the engagement index, or the metric I've just highlighted, takes into account your performance across all 4 buckets of engagement. From here, we can move into the engagement breakdown. There are 2 tabs in this particular chart as well: the comparison chart and the engagement chart. We'll start with the comparison chart. One thing to note is that this chart is always going to populate one level down from the overall engagement profile that we just viewed. That means if we were looking at the organization overall, this is going to populate by facility. If in the overall we were looking at a specific facility, this engagement breakdown would then populate by department. This chart will let you know for each one of the areas that you're looking at what percentage of staff fell into disengaged in red, ambivalent in orange, content in blue, and engaged in green. To that end, this chart will always populate from the highest percentage of engaged to the lowest. You'll see here that a facility called corporate services is at the top with the highest amount of percent engaged, and as you move down, the amount of green dwindles until you get to the lowest amount of engaged at the bottom here. Now this chart is helpful to compare each of your facilities or each of your departments to one another, but if you want more of an apples-to-apples comparison, you can choose the Engagement Chart tab, which will take each of the same facilities or departments listed in the previous chart, but this time overlay them with the same 4 levels of our national benchmark that you saw in the overall profile above, which will give you a little bit more of a direct comparison. One last thing to note is that each of these charts can be exported in a variety of ways depending on how much you'd like to interact with and manipulate your data. You have the option to export as an image, as an Excel file, and as a PDF. Below the breakdown will be your top driver strengths and your top driver improvement opportunities. These are going to be a list of a fluid 3 or 8 drivers that you performed the best on and the worst, which are calculated using an algorithm that takes into account both your gap to benchmark as well as the relative impact that that driver has on engagement overall. You'll notice that in each of these charts, the driver will be listed, meaning the question that was asked on the survey, the relative category that it falls into, the percent ASA, or the percentage of agree and strongly agree responses, which we consider to be our percent favorable, the benchmark for this metric, as well as your gap to that benchmark. The last 2 columns will contain some symbols, the first of which will let you know whether or not the data for that particular driver is statistically significant. If it is in a positive direction, you'll see this green check mark, in a negative, a yellow exclamation. And the last column will let you know if that driver is a top impact driver. Just to note, if you'd like to work on one of these driver improvement opportunities for action planning purposes, and you'd like to know where to start, you can simply click on any of the drivers listed in the chart, and our best practice crosswalk will populate. If you'd like a little bit more information about any of these suggestions, you can simply click on the name of the best practice itself, and you'll be taken to a site with either the case study or research profile that backs this suggestion. The last thing you'll see on this page are going to be the custom questions, which are questions that your organization specifically decided to ask. For that reason, you won't see a benchmark for these questions, but you will see the number of individuals that responded, the percent unfavorable, as well as the percent favorable for each of these questions. Coming back up to the top of the page, I'd like to shift over to the next subtab under the Reports heading, Demographics, which will give you a breakdown of your overall engagement by a couple of key demographics that may be of interest to you. The first of which is a breakdown by job roles. Now this chart will look very familiar to the one we saw in the Report Summary tab, in that it will always populate one level down and from most amount of engaged to least. The only difference here is that you have your job roles rather than organizational structure listed along the left-hand side. You'll also have the engagement chart once again, which will list each one of your job roles relative to its own specific benchmark. Here, it can be helpful to use our sorting capabilities and either decide to look at your job roles from the furthest away from benchmark to the highest above benchmark. The demographics subtab will additionally contain breakdowns by tenure, by shift, by employment status, and all have both the comparison and engagement chart and are exportable. For those organizations that have been with us for more than 1 year, you will have this trend summary subtab as well. The trend summary subtab will give you a sense for how you've performed across multiple years of the survey, both in an overall sense, broken down by facility, and broken down by individual drivers. The Detailed Drivers subtab will give you information about each of our 42 engagement drivers. Each of these 42 drivers is bucketed into one of 8 overall categories, things like communication and input, employee support, and mission and values. Here, you'll see a sum of the agree and strongly agree for each one of these categories, once again overlaid by our 4 levels of our national benchmark. Below this grouping, you'll see a Likert scale breakout of each one of these 42 drivers in turn. Now the last subtab underneath the reports heading will be custom questions. If you remember, we also had custom questions in the reports summary tab, but here you'll see those same custom questions broken out on our 6-point Likert scale. Now, the analytics heading is going to be very similar to the reports heading. The engagement snapshot looks very similar to the report summary subtab, but the difference here is that once you select the filters button along the right-hand side, you'll notice that you have much greater filtering capabilities. Now you can not only filter by the organizational structure and your reporting hierarchy, you also have the ability to filter by demographics such as job role, age, employment status, tenure, and so on. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to select multiple job roles for comparison, you can simply select the first and then hold down the Control key to select additional groups. One thing to note here is that we have 2 different counts along the right-hand side of these filters. The total response count, which will give you the overall number of individuals that responded to the engagement survey, and then you have the engagement response count, which are just those that are used to calculate engagement overall. One final reminder that the site will never show data for any groups of 5 or less individuals. So if we try to create a group with 5 or less individuals, you won't be able to apply those filters. Here, you'll be able to use these additional filtering capabilities to see your overall profile, percentile performance, trend, strengths and opportunities, and the full spectrum of all 42 of our drivers. We have an additional tab underneath the engagement drill down, underneath the analytics, called the engagement drill down, which will give you an engagement comparison of each one of the facilities in your organization for both percent engaged and its gap, as well as percent disengaged and its gap to benchmark. Here you can also see a driver comparison of all of the drivers on the survey. And you also have an additional tab to look at one specific driver. For example, I have a manageable workload, and this driver comparison will populate a chart to compare just that one driver. The third header tab is titled Indices. Now, indices are 3 analyses that we run on the data using an aggregate or subset of 10 of our driver questions to measure staff perceptions of 3 different types of scenarios. 1 being manager effectiveness, 1 being change readiness, and 1 being unionization risk. In each one of these tabs, you'll start with the employee perception of that particular circumstance. In this example, we're looking at employee perception of manager effectiveness. So you'll see the percentage of employees that view their managers as problematic, fair, good, and excellent, once again overlaid by 4 layers of our benchmark. You'll also be able to see the trend, provided you've surveyed with us for multiple years, a comparison of your performance on manager effectiveness broken down by facility, and at the bottom you'll be able to see the list of the 10 drivers that fall under this analysis. I won't need to click into the change readiness and unionization risk analysis because they are outlined exactly the same as manager effectiveness analysis. Whereas the first 3 headings, reports, analytics, and indices in the site, are used to see different cuts of data, the last 2, chart builder and custom filters, are used to interact with the data. They contain tools that can be helpful. Chart builder, as it sounds, will allow you to build a chart or graph for any type of breakdown that isn't already represented in the site that you might be interested in. In order to build a chart, you'd simply want to select the measure that you'd like to analyze. For example, performance on a specific driver question. Select the question that you're interested in seeing, such as, I believe in my organization's mission. Choose the breakdown that you'd like to cut the data by. Let's say I want to do this by department. And then you select the comparison group that you would like to compare each one of these departments by. You can choose a prior survey, provided you've had a prior survey with us. You can choose our national benchmark and all organizations overall. You can compare that department against your organization overall. And you can also compare each department against top performers, which would be those organizations that fall in the top 10% of engagement performance overall or driver performance overall. In this case, I'd like to compare against all organizations. Note that if your breakdown is a part of the organizational structure that rolls up into something else, for example, these departments will roll up into a facility, you'll need to select the overarching org structure from the filters button. Because I want to see a breakdown by department, I'll need to select a facility here. Then I can simply select Build Chart, and the site will give me a couple of different graphs that it thinks I might find useful. Here you'll see a breakdown of all of my departments compared to our national benchmark for that particular driver. Similarly, you'll see the same type of information in more of a vertical view. Here, the data will represent each one of these departments' gap to benchmark. Now the last tab we can look at are custom filters. Custom filters is going to contain two sub-tabs underneath it, custom groups and benchmark filters. The custom groups will allow you to create a group from your organization that might not already be represented in this site. For example, let's say I'm interested in looking at RNs across a couple of different facilities, Forest Cardiovascular, the Jasper Memorial Hospitals, and the Salem Medical Center. The site will first lead me through the organizational structure. It will ask me to select the facilities, then departments, then units that I would like to include, before leading me through some additional demographics, such as ages, employment status, shifts, and tenures, and then finally job role. Once I reach the end, I can click Save, as I've done for these two custom groups, and these two custom groups will now appear as options throughout the rest of the site. For example, if I come back to my Custom Questions sub-tab and select Filters, these two custom groups that I've created will appear in the drop-down menu. A similar story is true for the benchmark filters. Here, you're able to create a more apples-to-apples comparison if you feel that's applicable. For example, let's say you'd like to compare your organization against those of a similar size. You would simply want to select number of beds, click Continue, and tell us exactly what size hospital you'd like to compare your organization to. In this case, let's say I have between 100 and 300 beds at my organization. I can click Next, save this filter as Size Comparison, and similarly to the custom groups, it will appear both in my benchmark filters as well as in the rest of the site. One thing to note about the custom filters is that there are already two standard benchmark filters that will appear in the benchmark filter dropdown: your organization and top performers. The Your Organization benchmark will allow you to compare yourself against your organization overall, and once again, top performers will allow you to compare yourself against those in the top 10% of our benchmark. You'll notice that when you select this benchmark filter and apply it, the raw data itself won't change, but the benchmark filters will. And once again, I'd like to call out that this benchmark filter will appear in the You Are Currently Viewing tab for reference. This concludes the major functionalities of the online reporting site. Thank you so much for listening.